In Chapter 10, we are going to talk about photosynthesis. So, photosynthesis is basically how plants and photosynthetic organisms are able to obtain energy and are able to feed themselves to do their functions, as well as feed us as animals and humans. And one of the main organelles that are involved in photosynthesis is the chloroplast. The chloroplast is one of the organelles that all plants have, and they contain other organelles inside of them, all of which participate in photosynthesis. And how they do that is that they will take light from the sun. So I'll write it down here. So chloroplast is the organelle that participates in photosynthesis. They will actually take light from the sun, which is called solar energy, and then they will convert it into chemical energy, which is then stored in sugar molecules and other organic molecules. And this whole process right here is photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis affects all living things, whether it's indirectly or directly, and organisms need these organic compounds that photosynthesis makes for them to have energy, and also to make other parts of their body, their carbon skeletons, to make other compounds and to make other structures. Now, there's two ways to get these organic compounds. There's something called an autotrophic nutrition, which means that they are self-feeders. You can kind of think of auto is like you can, it does it automatically, so it self-feeds itself. It doesn't need resources from another thing. And then there's also called heterotrophic, which we'll get into. But an autotroph will stay alive without eating anything from any other living organism. So plants are able to sustain themselves because they are able to eat, they're able to make their own food supply and are able to fend for themselves. While humans and animals, we are heterotrophs because we depend on other things for nutrition. But autotrophs can also make organic molecules from carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and also other inorganic compounds that they get from their environment. The main source of inorganic compounds for these organisms that are not autotrophic, main source of organic materials for organisms that are not autotrophic, is going to be from autotrophs or from producers. So we as humans are not autotrophic, we're heterotrophic. So we rely on autotrophs or producers. And examples of producers are plants, and they are specifically called photoautotrophs, which means that they use light as energy to make organic compounds. So photoautotrophs are plants. They use energy from light to make organic molecules. Plants, the main things that they actually rely on are soil, water, and carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. So photosynthesis can occur in plants, algae, and other unicellular eukaryotes and some prokaryotes. So these are just examples of images that are able to do photosynthesis on their own and therefore sustain themselves without the help of anything else, unlike us, which are humans who are so high maintenance that we need a ton of help from other things. Now, getting to heterotrophs. Heterotrophs can't make their own food, right? So they have to get organic material or have to get resources from other organisms. And so heterotrophs are known as consumers, meaning that we consume things from other organisms, whether it's other heterotrophs or from producers. There's also something called decomposers, which means that they consume dead organic material or even feces. Examples of this are fungi or mushrooms. But all heterotrophs, whether it's human or animals, we depend on photoautotrophs such as plants in order to get food as well as oxygen. Because remember, plants, they take in carbon dioxide, but they release oxygen, which we need. Okay, so that was just an intro into this chapter. So in 10.1, we're going to see how photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical energy for food. So remember, light energy is coming from the sun. Chemical energy would be like the sugar. So chloroplasts probably, just as a background, evolved from photosynthetic bacteria back in the day. And they probably lived inside of some kind of eukaryotic cell. And the way that these organelles are organized, they allow for photosynthesis to occur. So you probably had some kind of eukaryotic cell, and one day you had a chloroplast that's usually distinguished by the color green. And this eukaryotic cell, engulfed this green substance, and now it became part of it. And through that process, you are able to have photosynthesis occur. Now, this is how scientists describe evolution to have happened. We as Christians, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense, because how can you go from one day not doing photosynthesis to the next day doing photosynthesis, and then having life being sustained that way? It doesn't really make sense. But this is what scientists are predicting or believing happened. So chloroplasts, like we said, are super important because this is where you have photosynthesis occurring in plants. Chloroplasts are located in leaves, and there are a ton of them. Chloroplasts are found in a specific area called the mesophyll, which is an interior tissue of the leaf, so make sure you know this word. And each mesophyll cell contains about 30 to 40 chloroplasts, which is a ton because each leaf has a ton of mesophyll cells in itself. And then an important part of the plants or the leaf is called the stomata. And these are really tiny pores. So if you have a leaf, on the underside of the leaf, you have something called a stomata, which are tiny pores. And this is where you have gas exchange happening. This is also where you can have water leaving the cell. You also have specific cells that are called guard cells that are located around the stomata that will actually help with closing the stomata and opening it depending on the environment that the leaf is actually in. But there are many components to a leaf to a plant that we actually don't really know about, but a plant is very intricate in itself, and there are many components that allow photosynthesis to occur and allow the plant itself to stay alive. Okay, so a chloroplast has an envelope, and so it's made up of two membranes surrounding it. And this is the two membranes that surround the chloroplast is called the stroma. There's two membranes that make up the chloroplast, and these two membranes surround something called a stroma, which is basically kind of like your cytoplasm. It's just a very dense fluid that's inside of the chloroplast. There's also something called a thylakoid, which are sacs that are connected together, and they form another membrane inside of the chloroplast. So the thylakoids kind of look like stacked membranes. So each of these sacs are called the thylakoid, but together this is going to be called the grana or the granum. The inside the chloroplast, there's also something super important called the chlorophyll. This is the pigment that gives the leaf the color green, okay? This is also going to be inside of the thylakoid membrane. Now, chlorophyll, because it is the pigment that gives the color green to a plant, this is also heavily involved in photosynthesis as well. So you can kind of see that this is a picture broken up. You have a leaf. On the bottom of the leaf, you have these stomatas that are tiny openings. You have chloroplasts that are inside of mesophyll cells that you can see over here. You have the exchange of gases happening through the stomata. Inside the leaf, you also have chloroplasts. So you can see that they're taking kind of one of these cells and expanding it. One of those cells they're expanding is the mesophyll cell. So this cell right here is a mesophyll cell. Inside the mesophyll cell, you have a tiny cells called chloroplasts. Within the chloroplasts, you have thylakoids, which are each of these sacs. The entire one stack of each of them that the thylakoid makes up is called the granum or grana. And inside the granum or grana, you have, or inside the thylakoid, you have chlorophyll, which will give you the pigment green. Okay, so just like we talked about, cellular respiration has an equation. Photosynthesis in the last chapter, photosynthesis also has an equation. So photosynthesis equation, make sure you memorize this, is 6 carbon dioxide plus 12 water plus light energy, which is from the sun, is then converted to sugar or glucose plus 6 plus 6 oxygen, which is what we breathe in, and then also 6 water. And this is not the exact reverse of cellular respiration, but it's very similar in how, it looks. So if you look at this kind of equation, you can see that, when we talked about cellular respiration in the previous chapter, we talked about anaerobic and aerobic. When we talk about plants doing photosynthesis, you have to also realize that this is a type of cellular respiration. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration both occur in plants. So make sure you know that as well. Moving on to talk about the splitting of water. Now, chloroplasts split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and they take the electrons through the hydrogen, and they use that to make sugar molecules, and then they release oxygen as a byproduct, which we need. So this equation is really, kind of looking at how do we break up how do we break up carbon dioxide that we breathe out and water molecules that plants need from the soil to get sugar, water, and oxygen. It was recently discovered that oxygen is actually coming from the water molecule and not the carbon dioxide molecule, which is over here. Water is split into hydrogen and oxygen by chloroplasts. And then there was somebody called Van Niel who discovered this, and he also saw that all photosynthetic organisms need hydrogen source to make sugar. And so when they make sugar, they're releasing oxygen as a byproduct, which is beneficial for us because that's what we need in order to function and to live and, be able to thrive. Plants can also use different types of hydrogen molecules, like they can use H2S, they can use water, which is H2O, so on and so forth. We talked about redox processes. We talked about oxidation and reduction. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis both are redox reactions, okay? I'll say that again. Cellular respiration as well as photosynthesis are both redox reactions. In cellular respiration, you have sugar that releases energy. You have electrons that are going to be carried on hydrogen, and they're going to be transported to oxygen to make water. And then remember, in cellular respiration, the electrons that are moved, they go to the electron transport chain, and eventually end up with the oxygen. And the mitochondria uses this whole process of electron transport chain and the electrons coming down the chain to make energy in order to make ATP. In photosynthesis, though, you kind of reverse the flow of electrons. In photosynthesis, you have water that is being split, and then you have electrons on the hydrogen from the water that is split that goes into carbon dioxide. This causes carbon dioxide to be reduced into sugar. And this process of that happening is an endergonic process, which means that it needs energy. Okay, so remember, endergonic means it needs energy. And this energy that they get comes from light. So the energy that they need comes from light. So here is just an example of what I'm talking about. Remember, you have energy from light that comes in. You have carbon dioxide that is reduced. That means it gains electrons. And then you have water that's being oxidized, which means it loses electrons in order to get your glucose or your sugar and your oxygen. Okay, so there's two stages of photosynthesis that occurs. There's two parts to it. You have a light reaction, which is solar. This is, you take solar energy from the sun and you convert it to chemical energy. And then you also have Calvin cycle. You have, in the light reaction, you have water that is going to be split. It's going to release oxygen as a byproduct. Light is going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll that is inside of the chloroplast, which causes an electron transfer from hydrogen, which comes from the water, to a carrier molecule, NAD+, which is going to be an acceptor. And NAD+ gets reduced into NADPH, which means now it gains an electron. Remember, that's what reduce means. And it gains an electron because of this H that now gets added onto it. And then you are able to make ATP from ADP through the process of phosphorylation, which is just adding a phosphate. You also have something called the Calvin cycle. It's named after Melvin Calvin, who figured out the steps in about 1940. The Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, which is in the chloroplast, and it forms sugar from taking in carbon dioxide, and then it uses ATP and NADPH. Calvin cycle begins with carbon fixation, which incorporates carbon dioxide into organic molecules. So what exactly is happening when you have, what you're seeing here is you have a light reaction that's occurring in, you have a light reaction here that's occurring in the thylakoid, which is like each of these stacks. Remember, the whole stack itself, it's called a granum. So the light reaction, which is going to use solar energy from the sun, so this is coming from the sun, to make ATP and NADPH, which are both going to help supply chemical energy, and by reducing the power to the Calvin cycle. So you have NADP plus that's coming in. It's going to take electrons, and it's going to help convert ADP into ATP by adding this inorganic phosphate right here. So you see here pretty much what I said. You have ATP that's being created because ADP and the inorganic phosphate are both supplied with energy to make ATP, and then you have NADP plus gets an electron that it can now transport to wherever it needs to go. While this is happening, you have oxygen being made as well. Now this ATP and the NADPH will go into the Calvin cycle. So remember, Calvin cycle is occurring in the stroma of the chloroplast. It's going to incorporate CO2, which we see up here, into an inorganic molecule to make sugar. Okay, so CO2 is going to is put into an organic molecule that is already present in the chloroplast. And this is called carbon fixation. All right, so I'm going to say it again. CO2, which is carbon dioxide, is put into organic molecules that's already there in the chloroplast, and it's going to go through a process of carbon fixation. The Calvin cycle is going to then take the carbon and reduce it to make a carbohydrate, which is just sugar and starches, by adding electrons. The electrons and the reducing power from the NADPH will occur through the light reaction because of the energy that it gets from the light reaction. The chemical energy is also going to be used to convert carbon dioxide to a carbohydrate, which is from the ATP's energy and also from the light reaction energy as well. So the Calvin cycle does need NADPH and ATP from the light reaction. So this is a light reaction. Calvin cycle needs these two items in order for it to be able to process. The Calvin cycle is sometimes, the steps in the Calvin cycle are sometimes referred to as a dark reaction or light independent reaction, because they don't need light directly in order for it to function, because it's getting all of its material from the light reaction, so it doesn't need to have light in order to function. But it can happen, but Calvin cycle does happen during the day because that's when light reaction is occurring. Outside of the thylakoids, you can kind of see we have all of this happening, right? So outside of the thylakoid, you have the NADP plus and the ADP, which picks up electrons and a phosphate continuously. So you can see that there's like this kind of cycle that's going on continuously in order for the Calvin cycle to be supplied from the light reaction. So you have NADP plus that's constantly getting an electron to make NADPH. Once that NADPH deposits electrons into the Calvin cycle, it goes back to being NADP plus again, goes through the light reaction again, and becomes NADP plus NADPH again. Same thing with ATP and the inorganic phosphate. ATP and the inorganic phosphate are combined to make ATP. ATP goes into the Calvin cycle, gets used, becomes ADP. I'm sorry, this should say ADP. Becomes ADP, which then goes through the light reaction again to make ATP, and so on and so forth. Now, light reactions and Calvin cycle are metabolic modules, so they take in ingredients and crank out products. So you have ingredients coming in and you have products being made, one of the main ones being sugar and the other one being oxygen right here. So that's it for 10.1. If you need to pause and, go back and rewatch it, you absolutely can. I know this is a lot of information, so definitely make sure you are understanding all of this material.